Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this session. And thanks also to the organizers a lot for organizing this symposium and for inviting me. I'll be talking about unconsciously predicting objects within scenes. Now, a little bit of background of my own research. So I study predictive processing in the brain and how it relates to conscious visual perception. And the relation between the two is an idea that's not very new, of course. People have been talking and writing about this a lot in the 21st century. And every now and then you get a little bit of historical note when people talk about this. And usually people trace it back to Helmholtz in the 19th century. But even in the 11th century already, that the famous Arab scholar of Alhazen already wrote that visual perception could be the result of an inference process. Something that's quite interesting to be aware of, I found at least. And even in the very old Ptolemy's optics in the 2nd century, this idea was put forward a bit. Now, these people are, of course, all very smart. So something else that they will probably have in common is that they have a messy desk, according to science at least. Now, this is, of course, just a silly joke. But the reason I'm showing you this picture of a messy desk is that people are very good at parsing these very complex, cluttered visual scenes. Because you have experience with desk scenes, you are very good at locating objects inside this desk scene. For instance, if I ask you to locate the computer mouse, because you know that typically in a desk scene, a computer mouse is located next to the keyboard and below the monitor, you'll be able to find it very quickly. The presence of this scene information induces a form of a prior expectation, which is able to inform the interpretation of objects inside that scene. And it's that type of prior information that my research is about and that I want to talk to you about today. So I'll be presenting results from 2 studies. The first one is a MEG study where people were performing a controlled visual search task. And the goal was to answer the questions, how does the brain learn and exploit spatial contextual information? And second, does this process require conscious awareness of what is being learned? Now, in the second study, I'll leave controlled visual search behind and I'll focus instead on perception of natural scenes and natural objects within those scenes. And I'll try to answer the question, can natural scene context impair the perception of congruent objects, which should be predicted based on some theories. And I'll get into that when I talk about study 2. But first, study 1. Participants were asked to complete a very classical visual search task. People had to search for an oriented T amongst L-shaped distractors. And when they found the T, they had to push the left or the right button depending on which orientation the T was tilted towards. The key manipulation I used here is a classical one. Some of the displays repeated many times over the course of the experiment. And those trials I refer to as old trials. So if you look at, let's say this is trial number 1. And then if you were to look at this trial, it's called a new trial because it's completely randomly generated. But later on, this trial will be called old because if you look closely at the configuration here is exactly identical to the one here in the very first trial. And I should note that this concerns the location of all the distractors and the location of the target, but not the orientation of the target. So the orientation of the target was always random, so that people could not learn over the course of the experiment the correct response for a given display. What they could learn is the association between the global distractor configuration and the location of the target. Now, a very typical effect in tasks such as this is people get faster in responding to old trials than new. That's known as the contextual queuing effect, and that was reported by Chun and Zhang already in 1998. So I was able to replicate this very clearly over the course of the experiment. People get clearly faster for old than for new trials. And this was also a very robust and significant effect. Now, the first interesting thing to note here, when you look at these curves of reaction time over the experiment, is that the old and new trials seem to be touching in the early part of the experiment and then diverge at some point, and then the difference between them appears to remain constant. And I wanted to know whether this apparent discrete jump from no effect to a significant effect is borne out by the data indeed. So what I did was a Bayesian model comparison where I compared models. One is a null model predicting no effect. One is a model that predicts a constant difference between conditions. The other one predicts the discrete jump or the switch point model. The other model, which I would have assumed maybe a priori was a linear model where people get better and better over time for the old trials specifically, or maybe there were blockwise linear jumps. And note that I'm analyzing here the difference between the conditions. So this overall improvement of reaction time over the course of the experiment is already taken care of. What I found was that clearly the switch point model was the best fit. So there seems indeed to be a discrete jump from before people have learned these regularities to after that they've learned it. And after they've learned it, then there's no additional benefit for a longer time on task. Now moving on to the MEG data, the key contrast is of course old versus new trials here. And what I found was a significant increase in theta band activity in the first 500 milliseconds of stimulus processing with a rather diffuse MEG sensor topography, which was a bit puzzling at first. But when I did then beamform or source analysis of this particular effect, I found that it originated from two very clear clusters. So one was in the right hippocampus, that was the strongest one, and another strong cluster was in the left superior prefrontal cortex. What I can then do is go into these reconstructed source clusters and ask how does this theta band effect evolve over the course of the experiment. And that's what I'm plotting here for the hippocampal cluster. So in blue again is old trials and in red is the new trials. And I'm plotting here the theta band power during these first 500 milliseconds of stimulus processing over the course of the experiment. And what you can see is that strikingly, in the beginning of the experiment, there's a considerable difference between all the new trials for hippocampal theta power. And then from around block 7 onwards or so, this difference goes back to 0. So then they become indistinguishable. The time course for the prefrontal effect, in contrast, is very different. So here the theta band power is equal between the different trial types in the beginning, but then it starts to diverge. An interesting next question is how do these time courses over the experiment of the theta band results, how do these relate to the behavioral effect? So those I'm plotting here. So now I'm just plotting different scores. This is old minus new for the hippocampal theta band power, and you see exactly the same as what I just showed you. And now on the same axis I can plot the behavioral reaction time effect, and you can see that as the hippocampal theta effect is ramping down, so does the reaction time effect ramp up. And the prefrontal cortex theta effect actually seems to mirror the reaction time effect quite neatly. So the second research question is, what about awareness? So does this effect depend on people being aware of these repeats being embedded in the experiment? It's been claimed several times in these typical contextual cueing studies that people actually are not aware of these regularities, but also this has been debated quite a bit. So I wanted to investigate whether I could shed some light on this. So what I did was I asked people after they'd completed the 22 blocks of the search task, did you have the feeling that some displays occurred multiple times over the course of the experiment? And there was just a simple yes-no question. After they answered this question, participants had to complete one block of an objective recognition task, where they're given a display, they had to say, is this display old or is it new? Now, what I saw overall in the experimental sample is that people were about at chance level, as you would expect, given the previous literature on contextual cueing. But now, because I had this yes-no question, did you have the subjective feeling that there were repeats, I could split the activity by the answer to that question. And what I found was that people who say they did not notice any repeats are indeed at chance level, but people who said that they did have the feeling that there were repeats are above chance level. So people seem to have some knowledge of their own awareness of whether there were repeats or not in the experiment. Now, the next natural question, of course, is does the contextual cueing effect, this benefit during search, does this depend on the awareness or not? So I analyzed this based on the exact same split. And what I found was very striking. I found the complete opposite from what we might expect. So both groups show a contextual cueing effect, both the people who did and did not have a feeling of recognition, but the people who had no feeling that there were repeats in the experiment actually had a stronger contextual cueing effect than the people who did have this feeling. And furthermore, in the same vein, if I correlate the recognition accuracy during the objective recognition task with the search task benefit that people derived from the repeats, I find that there's a negative correlation rather than a positive one as we might expect. So concluding study 1, learning of spatial contextual information transiently involves the theta rhythm in the hippocampus. After this knowledge has been learned, there is a switch, a quite abrupt switch to an exploitation strategy, where instead the prefrontal cortex theta activity is now involved in exploiting the gained knowledge. And does the process require conscious awareness? Well, no. In fact, the less conscious people were of these spatial regularities, of these associations between scene context and target location, the less conscious they were of those, the more behavioral benefit they were able to derive from it during the experiment. So far for study 1. On to study 2, where I wanted to study, can natural scene context impair perception of congruent objects? Now, to understand the background of the question requires a little bit more theoretical reflection. As we've seen in study 1, congruent contexts can provide benefits in search, right? They also provide benefits in categorization, etc. And these benefits go beyond these more or less arbitrary search tasks like I just showed you, and they extend to more naturalistic settings as well. For instance, people are much more likely or quicker to find a hairdryer in a barbershop than they are a hammer, for instance. These effects, these contextual benefits, are often interpreted in terms of the Bayesian brain, because a scene very naturally induces a prior expectation on what objects might be located within that scene. So people can exploit prior expectations derived from scene context in order to better interpret the objects that are found within that scene. However, on the other hand, many prominent theories of how predictive processing might be implemented in the brain actually posit a reduced processing of a priori likely stimuli, because a priori likely stimuli are not very informative. Instead, a priori unlikely stimuli result in larger prediction errors and are very informative to update your world model. So these a priori unlikely stimuli should be processed more deeply than a priori likely stimuli that can already be perfectly predicted given what we already know. So there's a bit of an apparent paradox here between clear benefits of prior expectations in search settings, categorization, etc. But when you talk about algorithms underlying pure perception, there should be a reduced processing of these a priori likely stimuli. So study 2 is devoted to figuring out whether we can actually find these congruency costs in perceptual tasks. So in fact, some reports in the literature have been given of congruency costs in perception, particularly in paradigms involving change detection tasks, like I also will present in a moment. However, many of these reports have been plagued a bit by concerns of unequal low-level visual confounds, for instance, between the conditions, etc. So I wanted to test whether I could identify these costs while controlling for these confounds using a fully balanced stimulus set. And even more importantly, in study 2, I wanted to test whether there are congruency costs in 2 different experiments. So taking it beyond this classical paradigm of change detection, seeing whether a maybe more unbiased measure of perception like exemplar identification could show these congruency costs as well. So study 2 will consist of 2 experiments, and I'll go over them in order. The first one, like I mentioned, is a very classical change detection flicker task, where participants were asked to fixate on the screen. Then they were presented with a scene display with a kind of a natural scene with many objects in it. And then one object would disappear. As you can see here, the cup in the dishwasher disappears. And this sequence would be repeated many times until the participant pushed a button to indicate that they had seen the change. After they'd pushed the button, they were also required to indicate with a click on the screen where they saw the changing object in order to probe whether they had actually seen it or not. Now, the key manipulation here is context congruence. So the changing object could either be in a congruent context, like here where you see the cup in the dishwasher, or it could be in an incongruent context, where here you see a roll of toilet paper in the dishwasher. And like I mentioned, here for this experiment we used the balanced stimulus set, which was published a few years ago, not by us, but thanks a lot to the authors of this stimulus set, which is very nice because, as you can see in this example, these scenes are fully balanced in terms of their key object in congruent and incongruent surroundings. So the cup in the dishwasher also appears in the toilet roll holder in scene 2, and the toilet roll in the dishwasher also appears in the toilet roll holder in scene 2. And there are many pairs of these matched scenes for a total of 64 scenes. So using a change detection paradigm with congruent, incongruent trials in this sense allows to control for this possible low-level visual confound. So what did we find? I'm showing here in this scatter plot on the x-axis the reaction time for change detection in congruent trials, and on the y-axis the reaction time for change detection on the incongruent trials, and every dot is an individual participant. So anything below the diagonal means that people were slower in congruent trials than in incongruent ones. And you can see very clearly from the scatter plot already that this was the case for the majority. And also in the average here, you can see that people were considerably faster in detecting changes in incongruent objects than they were in detecting changes in congruent objects. And for those of you who like this sort of thing, I also analyzed the data using a hierarchical Bayesian model with full random effect structure in order to generalize also not across just the population of participants, but also across the population of items. And this also shows quite a robust effect. So take-home message of this experiment is that changes in natural scenes are detected faster when the changing object is seen congruent. As outlined, an important motivation for study 2 was to see whether this congruency cost phenomenon, which we know from the change detection literature a little bit, is actually a general perceptual phenomenon or not. So for that, we developed a second task, a two alternative forced choice task where people had to identify exemplars of key objects. And additionally, we modified the task such that we control for a strategic concern, which I'll get into in a second. But the task itself was now even simpler than the change detection one. People were presented with a natural scene display. After a brief delay, they were presented with two choice options, two exemplars of the same category, in this case, one cup that was present in the dishwasher and another cup that was quite like it, but was just a different cup. And they had to indicate which of these two was present in the scene. Now again, one of the important manipulations was of context. So again, we could have a congruent object or an incongruent object that people would be probed about. But an important additional factor that we introduced here was the probe factor. So one concern when you have a congruent versus incongruent manipulation in an experiment is that people might always start looking for an incongruent object. Because if an incongruent object is present, and this is your manipulation, then it will almost certainly be the relevant object. So in general, searching for an incongruent object becomes a very beneficial strategy for participants to do. In order to prevent this strategy from working, we introduced this probe other factor, where even if an incongruent object was present, so here the toilet roll in the dishwasher, this would not always be the one that people would be probed about. It's also possible that an incongruent object was present, but they would be probed about a different object in the same scene. So what do we find here? We find, again, a clear benefit for incongruent scenes, in this case in exemplar identification. So identification accuracy was much higher for incongruent scenes than it was for congruent scenes when people were probed about the key object. In contrast, when people were probed about another object in the same scene, there was no effect at all. And also the interaction tested again using a hierarchical Bayesian, in this case logistic model, was significant. So takeaway here is that object exemplars are identified more accurately when incongruent with the surrounding scene. I mentioned that we wanted to control for this strategic concern by introducing this probe factor. Now this already by itself controls for the concern a little bit, because like I mentioned, now if an incongruent object is present, it's no longer always the relevant one. However, still, if an incongruent object is present, given a fully balanced 2x2 design, it would still be the relevant one in 50% of the cases. So overall, it might still be a beneficial strategy for participants to always look for an incongruent one. So in order to measure or control for this concern even more fully, we introduced a between subjects factor, which governs the proportion of trials where an incongruent object is present and the relevant one. So given that an incongruent object is present, this factor controls the proportion of trials on which that one is also the relevant one. So you can imagine that on the only 17% case, it's actually very inbeneficial to start looking for incongruent ones, while on the 83% case, it will be very beneficial to search for incongruent objects in general. So if this general congruency cost phenomenon is a consequence of task strategic concerns on the part of the participants, then we would expect a linear relationship between this between subjects factor and the congruency cost effect per participant. Now this is not what we find. In fact, we find that this is basically flat. So the congruency cost effect is here on the y-axis, while the between subjects factor is on the x-axis, and we don't see any clear increase with this factor. There's a little bit of a lower outlier of the 17% level, but you should note that just estimating the congruency effect is also much more difficult in these 17% cases, which is also why the error bars here are quite large. But overall, there's no significant upward trend of the congruency effect with increasing proportion of probe key given in congruent trials. As a final analysis, I'd like to present a correlation analysis across the experimental items with subjective inconsistency ratings. So the original authors of the database of Simile we used, they collected inconsistency ratings where they just asked participants, how inconsistent do you find this object with the surrounding scene? When I correlate that inconsistency rating here on the x-axis with the exemplar identification accuracy here on the y-axis across the experimental items, I find that there's quite a strong and positive correlation between the two factors. So, concluding study 2, congruency costs are a robust perceptual phenomenon. So it's not always the case that scene context will help you in perceiving congruent objects within that scene. In fact, when you're just probed about your perception of a scene in general, we find congruency costs and not benefits. These congruency costs, they had been reported a bit before, and we now show that they cannot be explained by low-level visual confounds, which had been a concern previously, or by task strategy. And they are not just evident in change detection, but importantly, they're evident in a bias-free perceptual task, namely exemplar identification. So, overall, summarizing and concluding what I told you today. In study 1, I showed you an MEG study where I find that hippocampal theta activity is important for learning spatio-contextual associations. And after that, people switch to an exploitation strategy, which in turn depends on prefrontal theta activity. This does not depend on awareness. On the contrary, more aware means less of an effect. And in study 2, I showed you that once task is no longer directly linked to your prior expectations, if you're just probed about your pure perception of a scene, then natural scene context can actually impair the perception of objects that are congruent with that scene. That shows us that the brain is continuously and rapidly updating world knowledge, in experiment 1 predominantly. This involves the hippocampal theta rhythm, and prior knowledge always influences perception. It can be exploited to guide behavior, which involves prefrontal theta, like I showed in experiment 1. But even the absence of an explicit task that is related to your prior expectation, so-called pure perception, which is not really pure, of course, but at least when you're just probed about what did you see, then actually prior knowledge can serve to downweight information that is likely, in line with theoretical accounts of how predictive processing is purported to work in the brain. These processes happen largely outside of awareness. Two corollaries that I'd like to give you: high-level, so-called high-level brain structures like the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex are not necessarily linked to awareness. Because in study 1 I showed you effects that clearly depend on hippocampus and PFC, but at the same time I showed you that these effects were happening outside of conscious awareness. A second corollary is that it's important to be aware of the task relevance of a learned prior expectation when interpreting effects of prior expectations. I described already that many research on context effects on object perception show benefits, but now I show actually a cost. And I would predict that if the task that you're probing people on is orthogonal to the prior expectation that they can have, you will tend to find costs for things that are a priori likely. Whereas if these prior expectations can by themselves be relevant for the task that people have to do, then you will find prior benefits. So that was all. Thank you a lot for your attention. I would like to thank Marius Pelen and Floris de Lange, with whom I did this work, and also the whole Predictive Brain Lab headed by Floris, in which I'm allowed to do this work. And thanks again.